So I want to offer a little bit of spiritual nourishment, but also practical. So I kind of wear two hats today. So part of what I'm offering is as eco-theologian. So I love to hear there are other scientists here. I have a degree in zoology and evolutionary studies, so I studied science. But then the what of the earth turned into the why. And I wanted to know more about the why. Why is creation here? Why is there suffering? And that led me into my PhD in Christian ethics. So I love having a foot in both worlds. However, I'm also here because I lead teams of volunteers. I lead teams of students and young people and grandparents and all sorts of individuals that are trying to do creation care. And specifically where I'm located, it's a very challenging context. And I heard echoes of that also with the individuals that have spoken so far, that there are joys, but there are also challenges. So I want to offer you kind of 4 kind of tidbits of wisdom that I know you know, but sometimes we need to hear this again. And I know the greatest leaders in my life are the ones that remind me sometimes of the things that I forget. So when you lead volunteer teams, I always start with it's an art form. It's a contemplative practice, leading others, but it's also a contact sport sometimes. And so the first point I really want to bring deeply into your imagination is that don't underestimate the provocative story you are telling and you're inviting people to be a part of. It's not just about carbon footprint. You are the hands and feet of Christ in the world, looking to liberate people from oppression and to live what it means to be God who is love. This is a provocative story to free people from oppression. And that's what you're inviting people into. I always say that start your meetings, start your programs with the why, because the what and the how and the when will follow from that. But your why is so incredibly provocative. And spend some time with that, because if people understand why, then I find that their creativity emerges. So like the native seed packages emerged from a program, and it's that tapping into that creativity of the high school student that brought it to a different level that you might have not imagined, but it was the why that motivated that. So if you haven't watched a TED Talk by a gentleman called Simon Sinek, Sinek. He did a TED Talk years ago called How Great Leaders Inspire Action. And he speaks about the why. And yes, it's in the business entrepreneurial field, but it's the same idea that generates movement on creation care. And I also say, don't get caught up in numbers. One tree planted is enough. One garden is enough. One seed packet is enough. One educational event is enough. And people that I speak to say, but the problems are these wicked problems. They're so complex and it's so urgent. And I said, but we are people of Easter, but we also have the story of the loaves and the fish. So if you bring what you have and you give all of who you are and what you're doing to that one project and that one person in front of you, it will be enough. But it leads to my second point, is that you have to sustain one another. And this is what you're doing right here. And I'm being sustained as I listen to the heartbeat of creation care happening. So the best leaders that I know and that I've experienced leadership from and guidance, they sustained and empowered their volunteers, their peers, their parishes, their employees. But you can only do that if you yourself feel empowered, if you yourself are nourished. So one story I love to tell is from the Parliament of World Religions. So in 2000, all the religious leaders came together of all the world religions. So the Dalai Lama and the Pope and all different people came together in 2000, and they have a series of all the different essays put together. And there was one story when I read through this book that stood out to me. It was a woman who stood up to address everyone, all the world leaders. And her ministry was to care for children who were abandoned, who are suffering and dying from AIDS. And yet her joy radiated. Everyone noticed the joy that came when she spoke. And they asked her, how do you do that when day after day you are ministering to children who are dying and you can't save them? You know what she said? She said her work is like carrying a large jug of water. And as she poured out to the kids, the children in front of her, she also drank. So I offer you this advice: drink as you pour so you won't get thirsty. So explore aspects of prayer, or perhaps go into the garden. One of the perspectives is don't look down when you're walking, look up. It actually changes your perspective on the entire world to look up into the sky. Um, Look to physical fitness and table fellowship and friendships when we can do this, and do this in different ways. Engage with what feeds your body and your spirit and your soul, because then when you drink this in, you will be able to pour out to your volunteers and people that you serve. The Holy Spirit is that inner presence, Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, that divine, creative, empowering, liberating force, the interior impulse at the heart of creation. And when we delve deeply into that, then we can drink from this and be sustained for the great work that you're doing, because it is great work and it is urgent work. So Jesus did this. He had friends. He went to the house of Mary and Martha and Lazarus to be with them. He went out into a boat and he fell asleep during the storm. He rested his body to nourish his body so that he could stand up and say, be still, and do the great work he was called to do. So we are made in the image of likeness of Jesus, and we need to do that. And if we drink as we pour, we can sustain each other. Another point, the third point, is leaders lean into vulnerability. And this is the truth I am grateful for that I've learned from Brené Brown. This means recognizing the very painful knots that are binding all of you and hurting you and others. But instead of running from them and armoring your heart from whatever it is, lean into it. So why does this individual, what they say or how they carry themselves, hurt you? Why is the denial of creation care that doesn't happen in the homilies? Why is that something that often infuriates or disappoints you? Lean into these areas of pain and conflict, and you will learn something about yourself and those that are causing this turmoil. But you will also find God there, leading you to new ways of life. So you might just learn that the way you approach it is throwing up barriers for people. Perhaps there's someone else who could come in and lead to where we need to go. Perhaps if we look at the why and delve deeply into the roots of the why, love and liberation, then the what doesn't become quite as important, or the when. The not then kind of releases. So what I've learned is that sometimes you might learn that a pastor that you're working with, he might be afraid to say the wrong thing. I've learned from my Jesuit friends, they're very good to me, and they come to me and they say they're wonderful in humanities and history and political science and scripture analysis. But one gentleman said he ran so far from science as soon as he could in high school. And so it's just unfamiliar territory for him. So the ecological part of the conversion, the metanoia that Pope Francis is calling to, scares some people. So perhaps if you appreciate this and you lean into it, what are ways that you can make ecology more familiar to priests? And I've already heard how you've done this. So if you're recognizing someone and it gives them an opportunity to kind of speak, perhaps there's some way that you can connect to their bodies that eat good food or breathe or walk on the earth, and it becomes so familiar. Perhaps you give them opportunities to connect the dots and language, and trust that you have a lot to offer the leadership in the parishes as much as they have to offer to you. So I I always talk about with my students Mark's gospel and the young wealthy man. It said, you know the commandments: you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not defraud, honor your father and mother. And he said to him, Teacher, I have kept all of these since my youth. Jesus, looking at him, loved him. That phrase is so important. And then said, you lack one thing. Go sell what you own and give your money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. But love came first before the really hard invitation to change the way of being. So Jesus taught us this: love first, but never stop asking people to change to allow others to have life. If you lean into some of these conflicts, you might learn that a fellow parishioner has had a bad experience with another ministry team. Not you, perhaps something else in their life is going on, and they carry these wounds with them to your meeting or to your organizational planning meeting. But love first. But then you can find systems and boundaries that can work really well for both of you. Perhaps you might discover that your own default is to kind of say no to new ideas. That's not because you don't want to, but perhaps it could be that you need time to process, and that is a part of who you are and your identity. So by talking about this with your team, then perhaps you could create a system and a process that builds in time that you need to process. Now, it might not even be you, it could be another person on the team. And what I hear from some of the teams I work with is, all I hear is, no, we can't do this, or no, we can't do that. Perhaps there's time that is needed for that processing, because otherwise people feel underappreciated or not heard, and they leave the groups. You might also reflect and find that your anxieties increase as well as your frustration when you perhaps don't have deadlines. I work with a team and they don't have deadlines. They have these wonderful events they want to plan, but they're not sure who's going to do what and when it's going to be done. And it leads to anxiety in certain people on the team and sometimes friction. Again, when you lean into this knot, it can be an easy fix. And what I learned about this is my struggle that I have is I do like to plan, but I've learned to make room for the Spirit, because the Spirit moves and sometimes God laughs at my plans, and I need to be that adaptable. But I've set up for other creation care teams kind of like project management. So begin here, and here's a structure, and here's a process, because clarity very much is kindness. And so start with the why, and then offer a life-giving process that has enough structure, but enough room for the Spirit. And then you have, I find, a more peaceful productivity that abounds. So leaning into feelings of vulnerability rather than fortifying is a better way to lead, I found. And if you look to Jesus, he did this regularly. He felt very deeply disbelief and anger and people trying to trick him. Ultimately, he felt rejection by those who loved him the most and abandonment. But he always loved first. And he found a way to work so that his work came first. So if Jesus can do this, then so can we. Now, sometimes it must mean dusting off your sandals and moving to a new space to do your work. And that's a gift as well. And the last piece of leadership kind of that came from experience is that don't underestimate what you're doing. Often we do. It's like everything else, it's part of everything. But really, you're asking your volunteers to be part of a stream that is much deeper. You are giving voice to earth and to the poor. And some of my favorite storytellers are the psalmists. They speak so poetically to the glory of God and to the earth. The firmament proclaims God's handiwork. But often we don't hear this voice. So in Psalm 19, I love this psalm. So if you can close your eyes and kind of day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words, Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth. Their words to the end of the world. You speak for Earth. You are making space for the voices of those we have marginalized and silenced to be heard. And this is an incredible privilege. But it's not a message that often wants to be heard by those benefiting from the current systems. They're destructive to Earth, but they're also destructive to the human systems that are built into Earth. But I went to a panel that by a social determinist of health, and the health administrator got up, and I was ready for all the data and the information, and she took her notes and set them aside. And she said two things that I will never forget. I don't need my notes for this. Two things. She said, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? So Earth needs you. You personally, you uniquely, your parish, but they need you. These problems are complex, yes. And I try and remind leadership teams a little bit of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was quiet, a thinker, but he acted and motivates a lot of us today. And he came up with 6 components of prudence. And I love prudence means wisdom. So wisdom for today has these different components: memory, reasoning, understanding, docility. Now, don't think passive, think teachable. Shrewdness, foresight, and circumspection, as well as caution. So those are 8 things. And when they're artfully employed, they really make sense in the work that you're doing. So if St. Thomas Aquinas was here today, which I wish, that would be wonderful, I think he would kind of take these for us to use. He would say, know your crowd. If abortion is the key issue in your parish, then connect it to creation care, because wombs are not disconnected from the landscapes. If evangelicalism or family life is deeply connected to everyone, or social justice in your parish, then connect it to creation care. The Eucharist, it's part of creation care. We erode our understanding of the Eucharist when we degrade Earth, which bread comes from. The second thing you would say is speak to their hearts. We have our phones that can tell you every point of data about every carbon offset, everything. The data is there. You can find it. But does it make sense to your heart? So St. Thomas Aquinas would say they need to know why it's important to them personally, as well as their family. Once they do, you just set them on fire. That's part of prudence. Docility means be teachable. That means God is putting people in your path to teach you and everyone else. So your volunteers are not just there to learn from you. You learn from them as well. There's something the Spirit wants you to learn. So lean into those vulnerabilities and celebrate the joys. Remain alert and awake. Remember what worked and what didn't. That's the memory part and the circumspection. Some things will work, some things will not. Remember those and work with them. Try to anticipate barriers, St. Thomas Aquinas would say, and circumnavigate them. We are Easter people. So just like, those lovely weeds that kind of pop up everywhere, you're like, you pick them here and they end up over here. Be that tenacious, because the why is provocative, and our historical moment says we need to be tenacious. This is urgent. And then also St. Thomas Aquinas, try and fail, but never give up. That is shrewdness. That is part of prudence, is that it's too important what you're doing to give up. And this is where I love Maya Angelou. One of my favorite quotes is, be the best that you can be until you know better. And when you know better, do better. So the toolkit I keep with me when I'm walking into creation care teams, when I'm talking to parishes, when I'm doing Earth Day on Thursday, I hope you can all join me. My toolkit has things that help me do the creation care work. My first tool is create effective channels for communication and processes, because clarity is kindness. Newsletters, what you're doing here today, brilliant. This is what helps inspires others, but the communication process is clear. Tell your story well. So thank goodness, thank you for being here, Zoe. I know everyone was saying that tell your story well. It's an incredible story. So tell it well, but tell your story, not someone else's parish. Don't, I always say, covet the earth creation team of another parish. Be you, because that is what will be needed. Find alternative paths. Inspire creativity in your team. And if you surround yourself with volunteers who you're learning from, your team will be incredible. Seek examples. Don't recreate the wheel. Exactly what you're doing here today. And I'm taking notes because I love some of the Earth Month and in Lent, and because people do great things connecting to it. Avoid possessiveness. That's what I find sometimes hardens our hearts to each other. Share. Also celebrate. So I love how you're already thinking of all these things. Practice the art form of when to push and when to let go. And thank you, Nova. And I'm like, oh, I'm trying to find your names on here, because you said you let go as a scientist, and you made space, fertile ground for someone to come in and inspire. That's the art form of pushing and letting go. And you'll never get it right all the time. And practice self-care. Drink when you pour. Because the greatest connection and wellspring of all is God. And you can do that by delving and immersing in creation. And that's where the care comes from. So thank you for letting me share some of my thoughts with you. Hopefully it's helpful, but I'll be here to answer lots of practical questions or spiritual questions, and to listen and to drink from what you guys are pouring.